Muslim League in this text seems like it's representative of the people of India, and since they were pushing so much for it, it seems like it's a good thing since the people of India are getting their independence, and a necessary thing since if India is going to get their independence, Britain has to actually give them that and allow that, and if the partition is part of that, then it becomes a necessity when previously Britain wasn't going to do it, and then they did it because it seems like India really wants this, and so it's a kind of mixed.
So what I'm hearing from you is they wanted the independence. The people wanted the independence, and so partition became inevitable.
Yeah,
because it was sort of attached.
exactly. At least within the Muslim League. It didn't really give place to other people, but and then a resolution to the struggles faced by Indians, Muslims, and British.
And so for our reading, we found that, yes, partition was portrayed as a good thing. There was some really strong positive language in favor of partition. In fact, in the last paragraph, it says, Lord Mountbatten, in order to protect the country from communal riots, decided to divide India. So it was like a preventative.
So that was the main argument provided, the communal riots, stopping the communal riots. Okay. All right, so let's move on to the second. We'll have a discussion on this later. So the second question was about the causes of partition. Maybe your group can start.
Sure. So the causes, kind of the idea of the British leaving, the idea that they created India and Pakistan, also the religious conflict and tension. Leaders such as, his last name is Azam, but I just shortened it he refused to settle for anything less than the creation of Pakistan. So it kind of shows that it was a cause that led to partition.
Okay, so the British were leaving, so they needed to create India and Pakistan to leave. There was religious conflict and tension, and leaders such as Quaid-e-Azam is what he was called, refused to settle for anything less than the creation of Pakistan.
I just shortened it for the board.
Absolutely, of course. Yeah. So what were the causes that your group came up with?
We talked about the British divide and rule and how it created the Muslim League, and the Muslim League pushed for.
So the British divide and rule created Muslim League? Is that what? Yeah.
Okay. Formation of Muslim League, and they wanted a separate state, but then in opposition to that, the Indian National Congress, they were basing their arguments off of principles of secularism, which means the separation of church and state. And that's like complete opposite of what the Muslim League wanted, because they wanted to separate based on their religion. So like just the tension between those two groups was one cause, and then another cause was like over time, like we could see the British intervention. Specifically, one thing that we pointed out was when India proposed like a constitution, they didn't include they didn't acknowledge a Muslim state, a separate Muslim state, and so that's why Britain like denied it. And so I feel like because Britain kept on interfering with India's plan or like what they proposed, eventually like the creation of a Muslim state was inevitable.
So in your narrative, I'm hearing the Congress had a big role here in some ways.
Yeah, it was like, I think there was a lot of tension between the two sides.
So we said that some reasons were, like they said, Governor Attlee said the British could not rule India for long with honor. They don't mention the reason in the reading, but they do mention that. That was
just that statement.
Yeah, that they were going to leave anyways. And we also talked about how the whole reading made it sound like there were religious tensions between Indians and Muslims that the partition was supposed to resolve, prevent violence. And then the Muslim League's demand for Pakistan seemed like a big factor in the reading.
Okay, all right. So maybe your group can start us with the third question. So who are the heroes and the anti-heroes in your?
So, because of the positive portrayal of the British government from the situation, we had them portrayed as the heroes from this text, particularly Attlee and Mountbatten. And the anti-heroes were the opposite spectrum of that, and they were the Muslim League and Congress for refusing to join the interim government, and direct action day had an impact on that as well.
So they were responsible for the direct action day?
Yes.
Okay.
Text.
Okay, so the heroes are the British government and and Governor Attlee and Lord Mountbatten, and the anti-heroes of the Muslim League and the Congress. Okay, your narrative on that. Who are the heroes and the anti-heroes?
Should we do two?
No, it doesn't matter. Whoever it is. Who
No,
is-
I mean, we didn't answer the second question, or the second question.
Oh, you did not. I'm sorry. I totally missed that.
Yeah.
Yes, but go for the second as well. The cause was there.
Okay, so from our reading, the causes were like everyone, well, but like the British Prime Minister, like Britain wanting to leave India after World War II, and then the violent religious disagreements between Muslim and Hindus in the year before that, and then also the Muslim League wanting the partition, or like wanting a new Muslim state, like wanting Pakistan, and like the Muslim leader not necessarily wanting to have it just be one nation.
So similar to some of the narratives, the British wanting to leave, the religious disagreements and violence, communal violence, and the Muslim League's role. Okay, so what about the heroes and the anti-heroes involved?
So for the heroes, it looked like the Lord Mountbatten. He seems to be the hero because he was the one facilitating everything. So he's like the overarching like authority on everything. And then the anti-hero, the leader of the Muslim party. Partially because he just seemed to be like the main antagonist, like causing problems, like with actually reaching an agreement. Like said that he just like really was against like the point of view of like Gandhi and Nehru. And then we put Gandhi and Nehru as like neutral parties because they didn't really seem to be antagonists or protagonists.
So that's how it's your text talks about the two. So yeah, your heroes and anti-heroes.
So for heroes, we saw Husky was most.
Okay, the other was the most, yeah. Okay.
And then for anti-heroes, we had Lord Mountbatten. And then kind of for like neutral people within his.
So we said because of how the British are portrayed as mediators of all of this, they're kind of portrayed as these good overseers of the whole thing. And so they would be kind of the heroes granting India's independence. And then on the other side, we have the Muslim League, who in the text is inciting violence and not cooperating with other people who are trying to work with them. So they would be.
So clearly, you all know that you had some differences in the responses that you had. I'm also wondering about the other two questions that you discussed, and so let's just open it out in terms of just an open response on that. The question around the voices, what voices were missing, and what do you think happened to the people? Do you get that sense of it?
We didn't discuss it so far in the group, or maybe we did. But one voice, yeah, we did. One voice that's missing is the Muslim majority. It was mentioned the Muslim majority.
Muslim majority voice in your narrative?
It was mentioning that they were kind of removed from the district in the idea of it.
So, okay.
We talked about how like Hindu peoples were kind of put in there with just like the name of the two things that were also made, but nothing about like what those different entities actually did actively, and there was no the Hindu faith actually labeled by naming any agency within this text, along with like sick individuals, like nothing we wouldn't even know from reading this that was something that was existent or a part of this whole partition thing. Voices of individuals who were from India who were against partition weren't really portrayed at all, or people who weren't a part of any of these three faiths weren't really portrayed, or people who were Muslim but didn't agree with partition also weren't really portrayed in this. Like it seems like everyone's part of the Muslim League and everyone wants the partition.
So ours is very similar. We said that the people's voices weren't weren't given any importance. Like it's only the leaders who are talked about. It's the leaders who are making all the decisions. Nothing about like what the Hindus, Sikhs, or the Bengalis, what the people actually wanted. And also nothing about the people who were against partition, like Maddie said. It's all just about the leaders and I'm just pushing for a partition.
Okay. Did you find anything on yours about the voices? What do you think about the missing voices and what is the impact on people? Anything on that on your?
So for the reading we had, it didn't really talk about the people that were affected by the partition, and also just talked about the leaders. It didn't talk about like those that had moved, those that had stayed, and it's mostly like split along like Muslim leaders and like Hindu leaders, or just want to talk about Sikhs or like Sikh leaders. And then with the impact on the people, like it doesn't really talk about what happens after the partition. It's just leading up to it.
Okay, so I want to share with you that you all had different lessons. You had 4 different lessons here from 4 different countries. You must have guessed that because of the responses that you had. And so your lesson was from a Pakistani textbook, which is being used right now. Yours was from an Indian textbook from Maharashtra, which is also being used in the state, widely used. Yours was a Bangladeshi textbook. And so if you hear the narratives, then it's really about the second movement of independence that happened in Bangladesh. It was moving away. They wanted independence from West Pakistan. So the whole narrative is around looking at that independence of language being the unifier and why couldn't we be a united Bengal. So this is a very different narrative from these 3 because this is sort of framed around the 1970 independence movement, which is 30 years later. And yours was a British textbook which is also being used, and surprisingly this is actually one of the progressive British textbooks that is being used, that at least talks about the event. You don't normally see it in the textbooks even addressed, but this is one of them that at least brings it up. So what's your sense? So think about yourself as students in those countries. You are students in the British school, you're students in the Pakistani schools, and students in Indian schools and Bangladeshi schools. What are you going to be learning from this? And more importantly, what are you going to be learning about the other? So what do you think a student who is going to be exposed to this content and does not know about the other narratives, what do you think that student's understanding or connection to the other would be?
It wouldn't be great. I wouldn't know a lot about the other if I were learning this in the textbook because it doesn't really talk a lot about the other. I think it talks about most is Britain. And so, like, perhaps they're an other in a sense in that they're not from India, but they're not an other in that they present a counter-narrative to what's being presented here. Like, nobody's against the partition, and there's no conflicting narrative within this text.
Yeah, and think about, the Muslim League, the way the Muslim League has been sort of framed. There is a whole Muslim minority population in India.
Yeah.
And what implications would that have in terms of the Muslim student sitting in the classroom being exposed to that narrative as well? Okay, so something, it's just, I know we won't have time much to process, but those are some of the things that came up to me when I started looking at these different textbook lessons and realized and these are things that are being taught year after year after year. And so the teachers who are teaching these students have also been exposed to the very same narrative. And they are perpetuating it again in the next generation. And so to think about the fact that these students and the narratives at home are not very different. The narratives in the larger political discourse are not different either. And so where do they get the resources? How does they start dismantling all of this thinking, which is sort of becomes a part of your DNA, right? Because you're constantly being exposed to it. And so how do you begin to start opening up and thinking about alternative ways? That's a really big pedagogical issue and teachers too. It's complicated. In those kind of political discourses where the conflict is so much a part of the social fabric, how do you start introducing it without having your own jobs probably threatened, the agenda that the state curriculum has, we're going to be questioning that. And so how do you begin to do that in a classroom without creating too much ruffles, as you might say? So I want to just share a piece of, but before I do, any comments, questions, thoughts, insights as you're reading these?
I thought it was really interesting how, I'm sure I know there's more to this textbook, but we spend, as Americans, an entire year or 2 years on U.S. history, and like almost an entire year of that is on the American Revolution and the gaining independence from Britain, and they get like 2 pages in this textbook. So I thought that was really interesting.
Yes, so I have to say that the 2 pages were from just the event of partition. It was not, I mean, there are lessons that go up, lead to the partition. So there is a whole text, a book that's to the whole event. But the event of partition is sort of given as this isolated event without any. So what I'm trying to say is the political narrative speaks to that. It resonates with what you have. It's sort of the culmination. So it's a story being woven throughout, and partition becomes the final culmination of that particular story. So you'll see the same thread about who's the hero and who's the anti-hero in that whole political narrative as well, even though there are other lessons sort of go before that, leading to this.
I just want to say that I was telling Cassie earlier, when I didn't know this was a Bangladeshi textbook, I was like, I don't remember reading about Bengal at all. Like it was all, and like we said, the anti-heroes were the Muslim League and Congress. This is like, that's not what I was taught. So I was really surprised because I thought it's an Indian textbook and I was like, what's happening?
Yes.
And I feel like the way that they're being taught, it's like, it seems like the Congress was exploiting Western India. The Muslim League and Congress did not support the formation of Bengal at all, the Basus, whatever, the treaty. And it's just crazy to think like students in Bangladesh are learning about this and like the way they think about us then. I feel like it's seeding, I don't know, like kind of hatred or dislike.
Yeah, because they were not allowed to have. So let me give you a little bit of context, because this is an important thing, because the framing of that lesson happened based on the independence movement of Bangladesh from West Pakistan, which was on the basis of language. Okay? So there's this whole Bengali language, which was part of it was in India, and part of it became East Pakistan, but they used the Bengali language was their language, not Urdu, which was the language of Pakistan. So they felt it was the Urdu language was being imposed on them, and based on that, their independence struggle was about getting independence as not a religious identity, because they already one religious identity. They're all Muslims, based on language. So the argument that you see here is the same thread of wanting unity, of wanting a united Bengal based on language. And so they're saying the seed was already there. We should have had it in 1947, but we didn't get it then. And so that's the argument that the child is being taught, that this is justified. So it's you justify the national identity that you have given to these young people. And you can't, if you start shaking it up, then it's problematic, correct? It becomes problematic. So if I'm not Indian, if this was not right, what happened? So I'm a secular state, but you mean for the Muslims to have their own state was justified? So you mean tomorrow if there is a separatist movement in the east of India, they can have their own, and if the Kashmiri want their own, they can have their own? That's disturbing the narrative of this united India that I've been taught. You know, when I was growing up, we were even taught how to draw freehand maps of the country. Again and again, I can still draw it. It was so much in my, the muscle memory that I can still draw that map. And in that map, I include in my freehand drawing the path that is called disputed Kashmir. but it's on my map as India, because that's what I was trained to think, right? So cognitively, in your drawings, in the geography class, you're all the time listening to that one narrative. Okay? So I'm just going to share with you a little piece of a clip in my work which I do with the Indians and Pakistanis, and what comes up when they come together and they see these narratives. Is this no sound?